I practice the Gucci of psychotherapy, so
Wow. Yeah,
$2,000 an hour. I'm Glenn Wood.
And I'm Richard Tadamir.
We're psychotherapists based out of British Columbia, Canada, and you're listening to Deliberating Practice.
In this podcast, we deconstruct everything from the foundations of therapy to its newest innovations and horizons.
We take a critical perspective on contemporary issues that affect therapists across the world. We share our own stories, both personal and professional, and sometimes we talk to other therapists too.
We hope that this podcast can be like sitting with the trusted mentor you always wish you had, helping you integrate and make sense of our complex and exciting field.
So sit back, relax, and enjoy the episode. For resources, show notes, and to work with Richard or Glenn for supervision, consulting, or counseling, go to deliberatingpractice.com. Good evening, folks, and welcome to the Deliberating Practice podcast. I am your host, Glenn Wood, and I am coming to you from the traditional territory of the Songhees and Esquimalt nations, the Lekwungen-speaking people of Vancouver Island. I am joined, as usual, by my co-host, Richard Tadamir, who will do his own language acknowledgement. Richard, hello.
Hi, Glenn. Good to see you tonight. Yes, I am in Langley area. That is Stolo territory and surrounded by many other Coast Salish nations, including Coquitlam, Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and others that we are humbled and just so grateful to be able to do this wonderful podcast on.
Awesome. Yeah, so welcome, Richard. Good to see you tonight. I'm glad we're getting together for another episode.
Yeah.
And maybe, as we start tonight, we ought to address the elephant in the room. We've rebranded. Mm-hmm. We are no longer the Psychotherapy Wise podcast. We are going to actually have to make a new music track to go at the beginning of our podcast, and I'm sure that will be something listeners will listen to tonight. But for those who have been following us, our devout followers, they will know us as the Psychotherapy Wise podcast, and we are no longer that. That was a fun little filler name that Richard and I had when we first started the podcast, but we are fully launching now as Deliberating Practice, deconstructing psychotherapy for a better future. And so that is who we are now. That is what we're going to be doing, what we're going to be naming this project moving forward.
Yeah, and I hope the listeners love or they can give us feedback too, on the logo that we have. I think it captures a great kind of circularity, reciprocity, kind of exchange of ideas. This is the feeling that I get when I see the logo, as well as some element of fun, actually. Like there's a little bit of a cartoon vibe. So hopefully listeners like that. And Glenn, did you want to talk a little bit about why you chose, like we decided together, but you really came up with the deliberating piece?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Richard. I love that. Yeah. So for me, I think we were really searching for a name that better captured what we were doing. Psychotherapy Wise had a fun vibe to it, but it wasn't quite speaking to the heart of what this podcast is all about. One of the things that struck me as sort of the initial chord of inspiration was playing off of the concept of deliberate practice, which in our space of psychotherapy is a somewhat well-known concept. Anyone who's familiar with Scott Miller and his work will know the idea of deliberate practice. It's what differentiates super shrinks from the rest of us. And, our podcast is an expression of deliberate practice. It is a kind of deliberate practice. That's what, Richard, you and I are doing. We're spending dedicated time reflecting on our practice in an effort to get better. And in addition to that, we are deliberating practice. We are sitting and we are speaking and conscientiously reflecting on our practice and discussing it at length in an effort to try to make better decisions about how to do it. And so the name, I think, just kind of fit. It seemed to suit what this project is all about, the joint intentions of getting better and deliberating, really talking about, really thinking about what psychotherapy practice is all about.
Mm-hmm. No, I think you captured it really well. And I'm excited to talk about today's topic as well.
Yeah, tonight we're talking about the money.
Show me the money is what all therapists say living in a post-COVID time.
That's right. Yeah. We're going to be talking about money tonight, which is a sort of really interesting topic, a really interesting dimension of the work that we do, which I think isn't talked enough about. Obviously, there's lots of podcasts and information about how to make money as a therapist, although making money and being a therapist can be a kind of oxymoron. But I think we don't necessarily do the critical deep dive, or other podcasts haven't necessarily done the critical deep dive that we do here at Deliberating Practice about the work, about the money, right? And I think the money poses some interesting problems in our space and solutions, opportunities, pros and cons, as we always like to discuss. So we're going to look at that tonight. We're going to look at the opportunities and challenges that money poses, what money does to us, what money does to our clients, and so on and so forth.
So introducing kind of this topic of money, it can be very charged. We need to make it to survive. We do deserve it. We are providing a lot of value to the world, and we are in the midst of suffering. There's an emotional labor. And so, of course, we do not live in some type of barter economy, as much as I'm interested for Glenn to discuss some elements of that later, that we do need money to survive and to feed our families and to even meet our self-care goals, right? Hopefully beyond just subsistence. So this is important. And it's, as Glenn mentioned, it's not talked about enough. It's a difficult topic to talk about if you're the therapist, if you're the client, and on both ends. It can bring up a lot of tension, a lot of conflict. And I think as we were planning for this episode, that became, we thought about that. Like, money is really this very powerful symbol and concept that tells us a lot about maybe where we're at in dealing with conflict and stress, and shows us where our values are, right? If I really want to understand someone, I often want to hear about what their calendar looks like, how they spend their day, and what they're spending their money on, right? Whether their hobbies, etc., but what they're spending their money on, it tells me quite a bit about themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. And I like what you mentioned just a little bit ago, Richard. And I think that that's maybe a great place to start, which is just the idea of money's a part of our work. We've got to make it. We do what we do for a living. And I feel like one of the primary tensions, one of the primary sort of sites of conflict or challenge comes with that, right? With the vulnerable position that it puts us in. We're not doing this for free, and we can't do this for free. We're here because we have to make money. But I feel like that conflicts with one of the basic attitudes that we need to have as therapists, which is an attitude of altruism, of really caring for, providing support for our patients, our clients, putting aside our own interests in the interest of the client. I feel like the basic position we're in as therapists, immediately puts us in a position of conflict, because we have to simultaneously ask nothing of the client and ask for money from the client.
You said it well.
And the two don't always go together well. Yeah. Well, and so one of the things I'm thinking about right away, though, because this is sort of a fun place to start, maybe, is like we were talking about. My initial thought was, oh well, I work for the PHSA, I work for BC Cancer, I work in a public mental health sphere, so money isn't a problem for me. I get to avoid this whole problem of the money, right? Because I don't charge clients for sessions, and so I don't have to talk to them about money. Sometimes patients ask me, does this cost anything, or how's this covered? And I'm so happy to tell them, oh yeah, no, MSP, it's got you covered, man.
Love it. And that's what we wish for.
No problem. You got no money, no problem, right? I think it's funny to sort of point out that just because I'm not worried about the money doesn't mean that someone else isn't still worried about the money. And in the public sphere, it's like you're not actually escaping the money. It's just that someone else is thinking about the money. And that shows up in sort of different ways, in the way that programs are structured, in the way that services are offered, like session caps, things like that. So I thought it was kind of funny, because here I thought I was out of it, Richard. I was better than you.
So altruistic. What a saint.
I didn't have to talk to clients. Yeah, I know, right? But it's not the case at all, is it?
Yeah, I've worked in governments, and literally part of my job is working like publicly funded program, grant funded program. And that has its own instability, right? Like a lot of grants, they can come and go, and I've had that the case for clients, like they were in the lurch while we had like a 6-month kind of funding freeze. So even in a public program, things can happen, right? And I think we're seeing that more and more too, that job security, but also in terms of maybe clients are thinking, well, this is the way that the service is. Sometimes it can radically change, right? And governments come and go and make very big decisions, and sometimes will change things fundamental. And that does really much, it comes down to money in most cases. So like the number of sessions that you have might be drastically reduced, et cetera. So if we don't worry about money, even if we are an employee, some of these things might go right by us, and we don't tune in when there's an opportunity maybe to raise our voice. And yeah, I think it's a responsibility that we have as therapists, that whether we're private or public or some mixture, that we have awareness around money. Who is the payer? What are the values of the payer? What do we get for the services provided? Are we being compensated fairly, or the person we're paying is being compensated fair? All of these different things play into the quality of the service, and really it's an ethical issue.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the point I want to emphasize is that it's always a problem. So here I am thinking, oh, it's only a problem for private practice. No, money is a problem. It's an issue at the center of all of our practices, because at the end of the day, we all have to be compensated in some way, and that there's a cost to that. So no matter where you're working, money is a factor that ought to be considered.
Yeah. And like even the sense of like, if you're in a community service agency, you might be part of things like their society. So they hold annual general meetings. And I remember, I don't need to go to these. And then when I started going to them, and I'm very active in the Canadian Counselling and Psychotherapy Association, and good partnership with the BC Association of Clinical Counselors too. But I for years, I worked in community service agencies, and societies require AGMs, and there's so much revealed, right? And sometimes there could be this rush to skip past some of these budget line items, but there's a responsibility there. There's certainly the people on the board hold a responsibility, but actually even the employees and other, right? There was volunteers, some of the AGMs I attended were pretty open. So even clients would attend, and for that transparency. And it was a really critical time to even question maybe sometimes how the money was spent. Like, can we give our executive director, a raise? Should we at this time, when maybe they're cutting other programs, right? Like these, if the majority of people in a meeting are saying no, and even if you're not the ones with voting power, there's an influence you can have on that vote, and maybe making people think twice, right? Where some things just become so routine. This is just the way that we do things. Yeah. Very dangerous phrase. Just, this is always the way we've done things.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm just thinking about my experience now working at two different publicly funded agencies, and how in both cases, the fact that I don't have to deal with money it's lovely on the one hand, but it means a kind of structure and curtailment to my service. On the other hand, I'm not in a position to negotiate infinite sessions with a patient. I'm confined to shorter term work for the most part. Sometimes, I stretch that a little bit in the interest of the client when it makes sense, right? But it's sort of like, it's just interesting to think about, okay, yeah, there's in the public sphere, the cost is always accounted for somewhere, and money, it remains at the heart of what we do, right? We structure our whole service around money. It sort of fuels and drives this whole engine of the provision of care in our service. So maybe we start with that idea, Richard. We can't escape it. It's in the room always. Even in the public sphere, it's there, right? And what else? Like, what else about the money matters or is important?
Well, what comes right to mind, remember we attended that great little lecture from, what was the organization again?
It was the Western branch of the Canadian Psychoanalytic Institute.
And this idea of bationing came up, this idea that what we don't discuss has a lot of power and a lot of influence on the relational dynamics, the quality of the session. And so often money gets into that. So that strikes me as important to note here. How do we start talking about it in an ethical way? Like it's actually critical.
Yeah. I think what you're saying is we have to talk about it. I mean, maybe not explicitly in the public sphere. Implicitly, it's discussed when we say, I can offer this many sessions, or this is the nature of our service, or whatever. Yeah. But definitely in private practice, it's an inescapable conversation. You have to talk to your client about money and the service costs and what that means, and billing and things like that. It was in that workshop, at least, it was brought up as a part of the frame. And I think that that's a good way of thinking about it, is that as therapists, we need to establish a frame. We need a kind of structure to the service that we provide. And we do this in the interest of being able to provide the service. We need to build a space for the service to happen. And part of the frame is money. It's talking about and dealing with the issue of payment, right? I feel like the place, I'm not speaking from experience, Richard, so like you're the private practice guy tonight, but I feel like maybe the place that psychotherapists get tripped up in is just, I don't know, like the money, like the challenge of sort of bringing something like an imposition, a demand on the patient. Like we're encouraged, sort of clinically and ethically, it makes sense for us to face as part of our frame. where the client can be themselves, they can play, and that where we don't impose, a lot of restrictions or a lot of too many boundaries on that, right? And yet here we're sort of asked to do something that goes against that. Like we have to, you have to, and you don't get to go around that, right? Like give me money, comes into it. And so I just wonder if that's a site of conflict. I want to hear from you, Richard, in private practice. And I think you also support other people in private practice. Like, what's it like to ask clients?
Yeah, maybe sometimes it's a values conflict, or you're touching kind of on a boundary crossing. Sometimes it feels like, right? But I think there's a lot of value, again, in boundary crossing. And boundary crossing, for listeners, again, very different than a boundary violation, right? Which is going to cause harm to someone, right? Like boundary crossing, that's happening a lot. That's happening whether we're aware of it or not. So that can be as simple as, the timing someone shows up to session, any of their expectations, any kind of difference, right? That occurs kind of in therapy. And there's a lot of value that can come from that. Yeah. So, I definitely advocate towards certainly a world, and in Canada towards things that would be covered, like through MSP, because I think right now in our time, especially, like there is a significant difference I see even before pandemic and after pandemic of people are so tight. Like therapy, I think in times of significant financial stress, it becomes one of those things that's cut, right? And so I've never seen so many clients say like, can you do like sliding to almost every client, even clients that I would consider, pretty well to do, right? And like, oh, things are tight, in our family. And it becomes a more difficult conversation, right? Kind of depending kind of on some of these external factors. So it's always a little bit of a stress, but it gets less stressful, I guess, when we know, and this is, I guess, the benefit and the burden of being a business owner, we know the value of what we put in. We know the value of the cost of our office. We know, the cost of our training that we have. And when we retrain, usually we increase the charges because we need to be able to cover that so that we can continue to increase the value and the quality of service for clients. So when you think about a lot of things and you're clear that just like any other job, right? Because sometimes we can get into this kind of holier than thou or more altruism kind of to a fault, or, I've mentioned this to you, kind of like this martyrdom kind of complex as therapists. And I know Casey Truffaut in The Wealthy Therapist, she talks a little bit about this. And in places where there's less money, certainly like in community service agencies that even, your payment, the employees are getting paid even less, are getting paid certainly less than stable government jobs, it becomes almost a value, right? And then so I see a lot of difficulty therapists transitioning even from community services into private practice, that this is bad. Like literally they'll feel like there's like a moral failure for them to ask about money. And sometimes they're actually more nervous. And I remember actually that was me. I transitioned into private practice right after working community services with very limited pay. I was paid for 30 hours a week. I think I did probably closer to 50 hours a week. And that was kind of just the norm. And the pay even for the 30 hours a week wasn't very good. So you're going to have burnt out people. Yeah.
And I think those are the tensions that I want to draw out. Right. Yeah. And so I think that's really good that you're saying that. Yeah. Like a lot of therapists, and like, that's what I want to sort of dive into a little bit more, right? Is like a lot of therapists, they feel they don't deserve money, or they lean more to the side of altruism. So the idea of taking money is difficult. How are you with money? Like, do you feel like you've mastered this idea of taking money? Like you sort of mentioned, things have changed where, a lot of more people are asking for sliding scale. So it's sort of like, how does that play out, right? Like, what does that look like?
I feel a little bit more of that stress, right? In that sense that like in the times that we're at of like, okay, like this client, I'm working harder with them to kind of figure out their insurance plan, etc. And so it's more work and a little bit and more stress too, because I feel like I really want to help this client. A value is definitely providing access to high quality psychotherapy, trauma informed services for my group practice. And we have a portion of it too that's like low cost, that's provided by practicum students for like $60 an hour. And really, we do not make money off of that. We price it so that we exactly break even.
Right.
And so there's a pressure even in that, actually, even within that, sometimes that still is a lot for clients. And it's, I guess, I have a tension, right? Of like, I'm wanting to provide for the client, right? Like I'm really wanting to help them out if I can,
Right.
but also the place that I'm staying at, or using it has rental fee. It needs, if my practice goes under, right, it affects the other people that are part of our membership collective, right? So there's a lot of different people I'm thinking about at once. And so I have gotten a lot better. Like it's stressful, but I am not
Mm.
afraid so much of having, like, this is why we price it the way that we do. And maybe we need to space out the sessions a little bit, or, find some other option, right? If this isn't working, because if you sink the ship to save one individual, it just doesn't work.
Yeah. I think I like what you're saying, and how it's coming up in my mind now is sort of like the need to reconcile these two motivations, right? That like we can't only act in our own self-interest of making money. Oh, we can, and we'll talk about that and like how that plays out, right? But like ultimately, like we're not going to be good therapists if we're not creating that space that allows the therapeutic process to play out, right? Where clients have enough space and we bracket any injunctions on them, right? But at the same time, if we don't make basic efforts to create a fee schedule to charge money for our work and to negotiate that, then we're in a position where we're struggling to get by, right? So I think what you're saying is it's something like striking a balance, reconciling these conflicting motivations. Yeah, one thing I want to dive down into is what I see a lot on Reddit. I feel like Reddit is such a great source of
Therapist
information.
subreddit.
The therapist subreddit, which
Yeah.
I know is a little bit biased because most of the people that post there are new therapists looking for advice and stuff. So
Yep.
but that's what this podcast is geared towards too, right? Like we want to help new therapists
Mm-hmm.
sort of like grapple with this stuff and reconcile it. So yeah, I definitely see a lot of posts about people in community mental health struggling with the money there, that there just
Yes.
isn't enough money in community mental health. And like, so that's maybe leaning to one side of
Mm-hmm.
the spectrum of money and altruism, is that like
Mm-hmm.
community mental health kind of preys on the altruism of us
Mm-hmm.
wonderful counselors and psychotherapists and social
Yes.
workers, and
Yeah.
and they go, yeah, you're in this work for for the value it provides to other people's lives, right? So
You're not in it
just
for the money. You shouldn't care
yeah,
about
yeah, you
money.
shouldn't care about money,
If
yeah,
I
and
had a
here
dollar for every time I heard that.
we're gonna pay you peanuts, right? Yeah, we're gonna pay you
Yeah.
peanuts, and you're gonna love it. And I think that's hard. I think that's not really fair, right? I see a lot of posts
No, it
about
is
burnout.
not.
I know, like when I worked at a community agency that will remain nameless, I got paid like below industry standard, and that agency didn't do a great job of negotiating wages with the workers. And it's not so common in BC. I think we're kind of lucky in that way, where if you work in the public sphere, like for the government, because there's health authorities, there's like you
Mm-hmm.
worked for child and youth mental health, which is like
Mm-hmm.
funded by a ministry, but same kind of thing, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
the wages are pretty competitive. But any like community service agency
Mm-hmm.
that's run
Yeah.
on grants or charity, like, oh
Yeah.
man, it's really tough to make a decent wage at a lot of these places. It's really, really tough. So I feel
Yes.
for people out there. Yeah. I sort of feel like there's maybe an advice point there, or like maybe just like something I want to say, which is like, God, like we're too nice sometimes, aren't we? Or like we don't
Yes.
we don't fight
Yes.
enough. Yeah, isn't that that's
Yeah.
a problem, isn't it? Yeah, that we're too nice sometimes,
Yeah.
aren't we?
And particularly, you mentioned too, in community services, you sometimes have people where it's the newest worker. So we know that employers sometimes can take advantage of young workers, right? There's more incidents. There was a whole campaign by WorkSafe BC a few years ago around helping, new workers understand their rights. Like, and because there was just like abysmal knowledge about even what their rights were, right? What appropriate time off was, what, if there was an injury, sick, all of these different things, right? Because even if you're not part of a union, there's also labor code, right? There's some basic
Yeah, yeah,
things, right? So it's not like you don't have anything, but yeah. And then sometimes you have people in the community service agency too. Yeah, that's the newer workers and people sometimes that are immigrants, some people that are in equity seeking populations. And unfortunately, they may have less of a voice and get taken advantage of more. And also, it might be, oh, well, compared to working at the grocery store or something, this is a great increase and I'm doing what I love, but it's not really fair. They're some of the hardest working people.
yeah.
I've worked in group homes before too, residential care
Oh yeah,
workers, and evaluated programs around these things. And they're working like 24-hour shifts sometimes in some cases with the most complex clients in BC. And the amount of money, because of the whole programming and everything, and the amount that the agency gets versus the amount, to be honest, that the worker gets, is there's sometimes something wrong there. I'm not saying all community service agencies are like that, but often as an evaluator, because I'm stepping more into that field now too, very often one of my recommendations, because it plays into the quality of the programming, is you need to find a way, agency or government service or whatever, private practice, whatever I'm evaluating, foundation, of being able to not just be client centered, but also like employee centered, right? If you don't take care of your employees, they will burn out. How do we increase the compensation to at least be closer to, some fair compensation like in the market?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, let's just put it on the table as it's not every agency, but it's certainly a problem in British Columbia. It's certainly a problem across Canada. It's certainly a problem in the United States. Like we're fortunate as counselors, as psychotherapists, that there's a certain like level of education and therefore a kind of expected wage that comes with our profession, which isn't bad. But like you, Richard, I started in the trenches. I worked with kids with autism when I first started, and I made no money to do really hard work, right? So I'm with you. It's like there just wasn't a good system set up in place. Like I think there was funding. It was great actually. I mean, BC was kind of a little bit of a maverick in that, where there was kind of robust funding in some ways for kids, but quickly became not enough money to provide any type of like solid service. Like we really had to sort of spread that thin in order to make it work, right? And it meant we often didn't see much of that, so that the agency could pay its costs, right, and keep going. But yeah, like the maybe like a similar thread to this isn't such a problem in the BC context, because here in our province, like apart from your practicum, which is I think unpaid, or like maybe with some
Most of the
positions
time
it
it's
is
unpaid. Yeah.
Yeah, like I had an unpaid practicum, so that was tough. That involves some scraping and
Yes,
saving
it's
and
very
getting
tough for
by.
students.
Yeah. But I know in the American context, in a lot of states, there's a licensure process. And so you can graduate a program, which also involves working unpaid practicum, internship, things like that. And
Yep.
then you work as I don't know if it's provisionally licensed or at a sort of junior level.
Yeah,
And
something
you
like
make,
this.
and
Yeah.
you make, yeah, and you're doing like, the same kind of professional level of work, but
Yes,
you're
you
making a
are.
lower wage. And you have to satisfy
Yes.
like a really large amount of hours. Yeah. And it's
Yes,
funny, we
this is
talked
a
about,
big issue.
yeah, it's funny because we talked about this on another episode. Like
Oh yeah.
one of the problems that that both of us really felt was wrong with the profession, which was that like we don't get enough sort of supervised practice. That like you call up a plumber in this province and they have more supervised hours and sort of like experience before they hang a shingle than we do, right? But then I suppose, again, because money is at the center of everything here, that the other side of that is if you do ask for that process, then people have to go longer making a lower wage. And again, good old Reddit, like so many young therapists are just like, how do I do this? How
Yeah.
do I get by
I
on
do this.
$25 an hour or whatever it is? Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, the U.S. is a country of extremes, so and you can see that it's obviously is 10 times the population we have too. So you can see the
yeah,
subreddit is dominated a lot by that. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I didn't even think about it in that way, but when states go to a level, maybe I would argue to over regulation, or there's it's so proper, so important to look at how regulation is done. Right, it can be done in a very mindful way and in a values based way, and hopefully the values are actually balanced between the client, the practicum students, the agencies. Right, there's space for all those voices. But often, we see that there is predatory practices, right, that can happen
yeah.
out of this, right? Like, oh, I'm going to have a whole bunch of kind of interns, in the U.S. system or something like this. And it happens here kind of as well. But
Yeah.
there is just that I literally, now the interns are beholden to me because they require 1,000 hours of supervision or something. There's no way that they can pay out of pocket, for that. So this arrangement is kind of, I don't know if it's too harsh to say indentured servitude, but there is some element of that. Certainly the people on subreddit wouldn't argue with me on that.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. That's one of the vulnerabilities that comes with money, and our need of it is that, especially when we're not fully licensed, like in the American system, but also in Canada, when we're just not experienced, when we're not experienced enough to feel confident hanging our own shingle and being in private practice. Or, and correct me if I'm wrong, Richard, but I think for some insurance providers, there's like an experience requirement. So in order to access some like private insurers, you have to have 5 years of experience or whatever first. A lot
Yeah,
of
that can be true,
a lot
actually.
of
Yes,
yeah,
that's correct.
yeah. A lot
Yeah.
of counselors will go to like a group practice, or they'll go into community mental health first in order to garner experience, or
Yeah.
just because it feels a little bit safer. But the words that we're choosing to use to describe this practice is the predatory group practice. I like the way you described it in the United States, the indentured servitude of internships or interns, right? That, yeah, we're, money makes us vulnerable in this way. People play off our altruism, and we end up being being screwed. It makes us prone to burnout. I don't know what else to say about that other than this isn't okay.
It sucks. It's not okay.
Yeah.
People need to band together whenever they have an opportunity to raise their voice. And I
Yeah.
think those of us in more privilege, so even if we have been, working for a few years, own a group practice or what, we need to think about, the decisions we make and the structures we set up. Is it from a kind of a survivorship bias? Well, like, I had to go through this, so I'm going to make sure everybody else goes through it too. This is just the way that it's done. Or, I think we are called upon to question some of these things and try different things, and there's risk. But yeah, I there's a lot of, also we can see in really economically constrained times is the increase in cooperatives. So there is a big blowback to this kind of predatory, extremely hierarchical structure, where in cooperatives, or it can operate, cooperative is kind of the structure. It's a legal term, but other practices can operate quite like that, like co-practice, practice sharing, partnerships, LLPs, different things, collectives. So they can structure themselves maybe in a mixed business model, whatever, in a way that gives the workers a lot more say, right? Like closer to like equitable or equal say, right? Or at least I think that equitable in terms of, hey, you're still gaining some experience. Maybe you still would like and need some supervision, but it's not an expectation of working for free or well below a living wage, and also hiding, any of these monetary decisions, and being completely non-transparent, and kind of having the person dependent just on this structure. And then the structure, if you do anything that doesn't, because I know examples of this, you do anything that doesn't please the group practice and it has non-compete clauses and things like this, you're out on a limb without knowing about the structure of the business and how to do your own thing. You're in the dark, right? You're in Plato's allegory of a cave, kind of.
You get sued. So I want to talk about sort of cooperatives or collectives, because like I know that that's sort of a model that you lean into, and I think it poses a really excellent solution to what we're talking about. But I feel like there's a couple more things that I could add to this sort of like problem. Yeah, and it's like one of them is like, I think that maybe part of what structures this problem is that we don't expect our fellow therapists to be greedy. That like we assume in them the same kind of altruism that we assume in ourselves. So I'm just thinking about, just like how, like if we sort of ask the question, like how do people end up in this situation? Like obviously it's our vulnerability and our need of money. But I think that like for some therapists, it's this idea that, if I'm joining the group practice of a therapist, like clearly this therapist
clearly must be so ethical and they should have such high. It can be a zero-sum game, right? Like that concept, and where certain players, they see this pot of money and they are predatory is the word, and money is part of that cascading slip towards going even from boundary crossings into boundary violations. And you're seeing things like in some predatory practices where they're publishing client testimonials and revealing the client name. Like literally these are things that I have to deal with sometimes as like a president of an association, where there's ethical complaints that I hear about, and then I have to bring it to the proper kind of authorities. And a lot of times the person, if it actually gets so far that we are bringing it to the therapist that's making a mistake, there's a level of ignorance or denial, or just maybe not even aware. Like it was just like these subtle, what do they say? Like the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Or it's also paved with these like micro decisions, and the person does not realize how far out of good practice that they are.
Sorry, I just want to make sure
Mhm.
that I'm understanding what you're
Yeah.
referencing. Are you referencing a therapist who's making a sort of ethical violation in how they charge a client, or
It
are you
not just no,
speaking
not
to?
just charging.
Okay,
There can be where someone is
yeah,
charged,
okay,
and again, since therapy is not regulated in BC at this time, technically a therapist could charge
yeah,
whatever they would like. Right? It's not illegal. It's just
two thousand
recommended.
dollars a session.
They could.
That's my going rate.
They could, and there's no legal repercussions to that. It is going way beyond
Mhm.
what certainly the market rate is, and you're going to raise some eyebrows, but it's not illegal. And we have lots of discussions around the difference between legality
I,
versus
I provide
ethics. Yeah,
like a
yeah,
luxury
yeah,
level therapy
yeah,
session. Like
yeah.
it's more like I'm like the Gucci of
The
therapy.
Gucci of
So,
therapy doing like yeah, exactly. This can be a thing, and
but no,
especially
but
in
okay, no. So,
yeah.
but sort of,
Go ahead.
I was gonna
Yeah.
say so, but just I just want to
Yeah.
understand what you were
So what I was
referencing.
making reference to is not just the
Yeah.
amount that's charged, right? Like that's not really what I meant. It can be things that actually
Okay.
are like ethical violation. For example, we obviously have the ethical principle of confidentiality, and if you
Okay.
are publishing a client testimonial, it's not appropriate, right? Especially if it's connected to an actual client
Right. Okay.
name.
Yeah.
There's lots. Even if it isn't connected to
Sure.
a client name,
Sure.
it can be problematic, and there's a lot of consideration, and that has to be done. There's whole ethical papers and case studies kind of based on this issue. And this is also, even if you look in the legal field for lawyers, in some states they're allowed to do testimonials, and in some states they're not. And in many states, in almost all of the states, there's at least some level of pretty strict guidance over what that looks like, usually excluding the client name and identifying information and things like this, right? But money has this way of really blinding us to some of these
Sure.
issues where there's
Sure.
any level of gray that can get filled in and stepped over.
Right. Well, I think this is good. This is a good example, and the predatory group practice, sort of indentured interns, is a good example of sort of the other side of the spectrum, which is that we can get greedy. Like when we're not altruistic, we can be greedy, right? And it's exactly that. Like money makes us, make poor and unethical decisions. There are people who get into this profession, they become blinded by opportunities for money, so they go sort of in the opposite direction. From, okay, I'm not going to care about money at all, or I'm going to try to avoid the topic of money, or
Mm-hmm.
my altruism sort of prevents me from negotiating money well, to people who they have a bracketed sense of altruism or no sense of altruism at all, and they see the vulnerability that comes in the space that we have around money, and they capitalize on it. So in like predatory group practices, like people who look for new counselors and negotiate like really awful wage splits with them, or like the example you just provided, the sort of publishing testimonials as a way of marketing. I feel like on Reddit or somewhere I saw something, and it was like a therapist who she was in the United States. She had an app that she
Mm-hmm.
was part of. It was a social media app. And what it was is the app would ping you, at different time intervals. And then when you were pinged, you had to like stop and like take a picture of what you were doing and post it onto the
Mm-hmm.
app, no matter what you were doing,
No
right?
matter what you
And
were
so she was in the
doing.
middle of a
Oh
session with a
God.
client, and she
Yeah.
stopped and she took a picture of the client.
Oh
I believe
no.
with the client's consent, okay? And I think even with the client's face covered or something like
Okay.
that, right? And the client was making a peace sign or something. I guess they were okay with it, and then posted it. And it was like, I think it became sort of a marketing
Yeah.
trick, right? But I really would
Yes.
question the ethical
Yes.
stance of that therapist, for one.
Absolutely.
And then also, like, what's the quality of the service that you're getting from this therapist when they're more than happy to stop the session in the interest of their social media platform that they're a part of,
Yes.
right? So
Very concerning.
money makes us
Yes, it
stupid.
does.
So let's hold this up, because, like, okay, do you have anything more to add to the altruism piece, Richard?
Mm.
Like, sort of how, like, I think what we're trying to say is that, okay, our altruism makes us vulnerable in the area
Yes.
of money, because we won't sort of value ourselves enough. We won't ask
Mm-hmm.
for it. We leave ourselves to sort of like to predation, or we put ourselves into
Mm-hmm.
like financially
Yes.
insufficient situations, right? Do we want to add anything to that? Or are we ready to really dive more into the greed,
Um,
if you will?
yeah,
Is there
no,
anything more
no.
to
I
say on
think
that
we can
table?
dive into the greed, and if we want to, if there's big things that come back
Okay.
to the altruism, then
Okay.
we can discuss that. I guess the only thing I'll say
Sure.
is just
Sure.
yeah, the piece where, and I think that came too from the training, the psychoanalytic training, and it was studying around boundary crossing and violations was, yeah, and maybe this actually does go into the greed too, is this idea of misguided altruism. That was one thing that I got taken away from it. I don't think they actually use that word, but I thought about that is these pieces.
Totally.
Okay, yeah, I really wanted, maybe I even have the intention of like, I really want my practice to do well so I can help more people and, have, provide more spaces for people that are, in more need, whatever, right? But then, especially when we don't have good supervision, consultation, we're not like, the two of us talking and having a wider community of practice, this accountability, we develop kind of our own set of ethics, right? Especially if there's any gray area in the ethics code, right? But even there, even if there isn't, we can kind of interpret it kind of in our own way. It might be clear to a lot of other people. And so she made a really good point about, if thinking about each decision you make, if you are scared to tell it to a colleague, this is probably something that you need to at least examine and really need to talk about it with a colleague. So I guess what I say is like, because again, I've been part of like ethics investigations and things like this, that it's so rare that there's like this evil, like predatory, therapist or group practice owner that's like, I entered this field to take advantage of people. But they, over time, their morality kind of slips and their ethics kind of slip, and they end up becoming a very different person. This connects to also an idea of like virtue ethics. Is each decision that I'm making, it can either make me into the person that I would want to be, and I would want my family to see who I am and all of this stuff, my community would be proud of, or it's going the opposite. So I just really want to emphasize that point of these small little decisions over time add up to really big shifts.
Yeah, that's a good reminder, Richard, of the kind of vulnerabilities that our altruistic attitude presents to us. Like in that workshop, there was really like some egregious ones presented to us. But I think maybe what we can emphasize for our listeners is the need to work through that in some ways. That one of the things that we can't do is actually leave our altruism unchecked. Yes. And we need to sort of understand the motivations or what drives that in some ways. I think it's like almost universal. The people that go into this work, they're driven by like an altruistic sense, which isn't a problem in and of itself. It's a beautiful thing because we can offer this tremendous service that we do that can help so many people. But I think most of us have to, we have to do some work around that for sure, because almost invariably it's driven by some, problem that we experienced in our lives, right? Altruism became a kind of solution. It became the position that we needed to take in our family system, or it had some other important dynamic function that if we don't appreciate, if we don't understand why we're here helping people the way that we are and what we get out of that, then we will drive ourselves and them into dubious ethical territory and boundary violations. And
on one side, there's the greed.
What a great reminder, right?
On one side, there's the greed. And then on the other side, and we think, we might be doing this, as a favor to, or just to help a client in need, of kind of just like unquestioningly, okay, like I'm going to do this service pro bono or massively reduce the cost, sliding scale, things like this. And then we have to think about, well, is that actually equitable or fair, right? To the, are we, on what basis are we making those decisions for the clients? Who is involved in those decisions, right? Who is affected by those decisions? So greed absolutely can be affected by kind of this misguided altruism and these micro decisions, but also when we make this decision to, again, probably most of the time coming from a good place, a good intention, wanting to help the client, well, there is perhaps very serious unintended consequences to those decisions.
Yeah, I think we just need to always ask why, right? Why am I doing this, right? What's driving this in me?
I like the ethical question of like, if what I was doing was, again, published to my friends, my colleagues on a paper, gets us to stop and think for a second.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So just a good sober reminder, this whole money business is part of keeping the frame. And in order to keep the frame, we have to do our work, right? Because we have to be strong in that. We have to be strong in that position. And altruism is actually a vulnerability in the frame sometimes. So I love that, Richard. I love that. But yeah, let's dive into the greed now, because of course is the other side, right? There's all the ways that greed motivates us around money. We get so excited about money. So we've got the predatory group practices out there. We've got indentured internists. we talked about this, another concept. I don't know if we can coin this, but I liked it a lot, Richard. The idea of private
Oh
practice
yes,
drain. That
that's a real thing.
that yeah, as like a vulnerability in our system is that people don't make enough money in community mental health or in the public system, and so they go to
Yeah,
private practice where they can make more money, and they
yeah,
do, and so we lose lots of good counselors to greed.
absolutely.
Maybe not greed in some
Well,
cases,
maybe it's
maybe
like,
just
oh,
like
now I actually have
looking
enough
for
to
a decent
feed my
wage, right?
family
But
or afford a little bit better life. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. But still, yes, that's the part.
yeah,
That's
yeah.
the systematic
But
problem of having
yeah,
still a system that it doesn't provide true universal coverage. Right? It's just it's an example of the same thing you find in medicine. It's just because we have very few of our services in counseling are covered by directly by the government payer,
mm,
that it's a bigger percentage, right? Like I was looking at the labor statistics, and the majority, right, of therapists in BC, it was like in the 40+%, are part time, right? And so they're working, and as you delve deeper into that, you're saying, okay, they're working at a couple of different places, right? Obviously to survive, but often when I talk to therapists, right, they kind of have to in many cases, right? If you're living in an expensive city as Vancouver, and now you have kids, etc. Victoria is not that much better. Kelowna is not that much
it's
better,
not.
etc. That maybe you're working in a public program, and then you are also doing private practice on the side. But then sometimes you begin the drain towards maybe less and less of the public, or completely leaving the public. And this before there was this still can happen actually even in medicine, because there is levels of there's certain private clinics, private surgery clinics, etc. Alberta is a very big case of this, where doctors are leaving for kind of a private clinic, right, that's serving executives and stuff like this. But it happens a lot in the therapy field too. So that's what we mean by private practice, right?
Yeah, and I think the challenge is that it creates inequities because not unlike with healthcare, what the public system provides is not the
Yeah.
same as what the private system can provide. If you go to publicly covered counseling, like we mentioned earlier, it's always constrained or limited in some way because money is
Mm-hmm.
still at the center of it. So you get 10
Mm-hmm.
sessions, or you get a brief solution
Yeah.
focused modality, or you get structured CBT, DBT, whatever, right? You don't necessarily get choice or agency in selecting the kind of therapy that you receive that you do when
Let's
you
be
have
blunt. You
money.
get a classist system where the more money you have, certainly in
Yeah,
therapy,
yeah,
let's talk
yeah,
about BC, but I think it applies to most of Canada too. The more money you have, the more and better, more
yeah.
sessions, the better quality, the better choice you have in therapy in general.
And then I think there's an inequity in quality of service too, because again, people who know what they're worth, they
Mm-hmm.
often don't stay in the public system because of the constraints that are placed on it by the money, considering the money, right? So we're almost all forced in some way to do private
Mm-hmm.
practice, or many people
Mm-hmm.
are. It's incentivized, right? So there's just a sort of like a loss of
Yes.
quality that comes with
Yeah.
public service, right? I don't want to be critical of
Well, it's
like
not. It's
the,
not the public
my public
system's
brothers and
fault. It's not the
sisters.
public system.
I'm not
No.
suggesting that all of us in the public sphere are
No.
like really crappy at our jobs, but I think like that. I
Yeah.
think about it sometimes. Like, okay, private practice
Mm-hmm.
probably in the future. Yeah, I love the idea of
Mm-hmm.
making more money or whatever, right? Like it poses a tremendous opportunity. It makes it hard to stay sometimes and do the important work that we do, because we do accessible work, and that's one of the values of the work that we do. Like my counseling is pretty low barrier. You just need cancer, right? And it's like then you get some pretty good counseling with me or my colleagues. And so that's awesome
Mm-hmm.
that we can provide that service, right? As well as all the other suite of services that are available. I think one of the issues it's created is kind of a vacancy
Yes.
problem, because I know like a couple of years ago when I was searching for jobs when I first moved to Victoria, I had my pick, and it's like there's a lot of positions in the public sphere that are
That's persisted.
vacant, and I
Yes.
think they're still vacant, or
Still
there's
record high
trouble filling them.
vacancies. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and especially in some of
Mental
the
health and
tougher
substance
positions
use.
like
Yes.
substance
You got
abuse,
it.
yes, MHS use. I don't know about
Yep.
forensic, but I feel like
Yep.
forensic could be a
Can
hard place
be.
to staff too sometimes. And so again, this is a sort of a money problem, right? That there's maybe not enough
Mm-hmm.
money in the public sphere, and so as a result, it can't do what it sets out to do, right?
Well, the problem is when you have a two class system. So basically, as private clinics begin to charge more, right? And so I'm talking about therapists now. So as we can charge more and we're looking at the market, and the market continues to kind of increase, right? Then that means in the public space, they have to try to pay therapists, which is fine. But then again, it's unregulated. It becomes basically kind of this it's an example in systems theory of a feedback cycle, a reinforcing feedback cycle. Yes, I think the public system, it does need more funding. It's still not funded as much, but we know that in other countries too, there's ways of, even with less funding, some of their healthcare income. So for example, in Costa Rica, that has a preventative model and there is more universal coverage, but they're really focusing the money more preventative, earlier mental health issue, earlier physical issues, preventing debilitating and chronic disease as much as possible. People are living just as long, and actually the years that they're living, they're in good health, and the system costs a lot less money. And you are getting doctors that are doing house calls, they're providing a good quality of service. So we don't have to do it the way that we do, but this is the issue of kind of, especially unbridled kind of low regulated privatization, but even a little bit of privatization. And again, this is weird saying this as a business owner, but I would much rather be like kind of my doctor colleagues where it's covered by MSP, right? Like I'm getting paid, and I'm getting paid for the amount of work that I do and the outcomes, because there's a shift now to outcomes-based care, which is great, but there's coverage for my clients. And I know also what is, the charge of a certain procedure or the time spent or whatever it is, right? Yeah.
Yeah, we talked about in our prep the European examples, I guess, of robust publicly covered funding. I think in Germany, this is the example I had provided, and if this is the case, it's great. If there's German listeners out there and I'm wrong, please email or comment and correct me, and then come on the podcast and talk about the German system with us. But I think it was like in Germany, you can access any mental health care professional that's licensed and provides therapy, is funded publicly. There's not necessarily session limits, so you can access long form therapy if you want to. They do incentivize shorter term psychotherapy by paying a little bit more for it. But I mean, everyone makes enough. So if you want to take on clients that want long term therapy and you can provide that, it's not like you're starving, right? And so it eliminates some of these inequities that we're talking about. And it also eliminates the problem of private practice drain, because kind of in some ways, everyone is a publicly, sort of funded, and there's just a lot of accessibility, right? And you have choice, and you have some agency. So I think it's a good solution. It's probably not a cheap solution.
What is more expensive?
But it's a good,
the way that we do it is actually far more expensive.
It's untreated public health problems. Now you had mentioned Nova Scotia too.
Nova Scotia is worth mentioning. They've worked really hard. There's been a lot of advocacy efforts between therapists, clients, government, different organizations. CCP has been part of that as well, to push the government towards covered. It's called MSI where they are. So they're medical services insurance. So there's already the pilot, which I think is close to finishing, where they covered a significant amount of therapy, a certain number of sessions. I don't know what the number was for population that was coming through. So basically that they would get access to kind of any therapist who was licensed there, regulated there. So it gave patients choice, and the government paid, upfront. It paid through MSI the services, so the client would not have to pay out of pocket. And it was successful. And the next push, and actually there's supposed to be a vote on it sometime in July, that can be expanded to all of Nova Scotia and all of the Nova Scotians for full coverage of, I don't know if, again, there'll be a certain number of sessions that are covered, and past that, it's not whatever, but that would be universal mental health coverage. That's a model, and we need provinces to do that.
That's so great. That's even just a step.
It's a good model
in that direction. Yeah, it's really awesome. Yeah. And so hopefully there are similar efforts across the provinces, or Nova Scotia could give an example. I think this is a funny sort of irony of the Canadian versus the American system, is like, actually in the United States, people don't necessarily have this problem, because a lot of people's health insurers actually provide like really robust access to mental health care. So I've seen some of my American colleagues on Reddit talking about seeing patients for like 2 years, twice a week, not necessarily even being like long form therapists, but just like, this is just the way it's played out with this particular client. And they go, okay, is the insurance, company going to like going to jump on me for this, but like the client has the diagnosis that warrants that kind of intensive service, and the insurance provider provides it. Now there's issues on the insurance side of like, our American colleagues are very pissed off having to deal with insurance providers all the time and all the crap and the hoops that they make them jump through. But it's sort of, to me, it's funny, like in the world of sort of privately funded healthcare in the United States, that like actually you can get better service in some cases than you can in Canada.
And again,
right?
there was a big change with kind of
the
nickname, the Obamacare, where there became an additional insurance plan that is government funded that at least provides some coverage. Now, again, there is issues, though. It's definitely far from universal, because you'll have insurance networks that will cover, their therapists and they'll accept certain types of insurance and they won't accept others. Again, in some states, they are pushing stronger against this, and they have kind of some federal, mandate and some federal teeth kind of behind this with Obamacare to support this. But in other states, it can still be very inequitable in that your insurance really doesn't get you very much, right? It doesn't get you even connected to there's providers that are out of network that are just not really available to you. So it's complicated. And so if there's US listeners, I'd love to hear.
I don't want to play it off as a
universal
opinion and service.
Talk to us more, because we'd really love to talk more about it. I wanted to mention something. actformentalhealth.ca would be a cool thing for our Canadians to think about. And this was actually the Canadian Mental Health Association. They have been a great policy designer and advocate around mental health, as well as running a lot of programs in a lot of areas of Canada. And so the actformentalhealth.ca, that is the big push right now around universal mental health care coverage, that mental health is not just a frill, that actually costs our system a lot more to provide this kind of scattershot approach, where then people do have to present to a hospital and it's costing us tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars, depending on, the severity and the issues happening. But that actually it's more expensive and it's less humane the way that it is right now. And that there was a commitment to, I don't know if we remember, but when the Liberals came in, to provide much more, but basically universal mental health care is what they committed to. And there is obviously an election next year, and that has not been followed through yet. So it's very important around election times and in that follow-up, because that, kind of the run for election, it's already starting to happen. We can hear about it. It's a time to hold the government accountable with your vote, and where these organizations are pumping up their advocacy to hopefully get some movement on this. Another great book that I'm going to recommend is Health for All. And this is by Jane Philpott. She was the former Minister of Health for Canada. And now she was also at Queen's University, their Dean of Health Sciences. And she, an amazing proponent for universal healthcare. And she significantly talks in the book about mental health care. And even like the idea of mental health care is also like, it's a spiritual like value, right? That, as Gandhi mentioned, like we can judge a society by what it provides to the most vulnerable members. So a great book on actually the practicalities, that it is very practical and very affordable. And a lot of things have already been thought out exactly on how to deliver it, right? And federal government has said a lot of, well, this is a provincial issue. Well, the Canada, Health Act, that's a Canadian issue and a Canadian piece of legislation that enables and gives funding to the provinces under certain specifications to deliver care. So it is both a provincial and very much a federal issue. And the provinces won't be able to follow through very well. You have exceptions like Nova Scotia, unless there is something robust, like the robust accountability of kind of an updated version of the Canada Health Act that includes universal mental health care coverage. And end of rant.
Yeah. Thanks, Richard. So good. I think I really like the idea of we should do a whole episode on the idea of sort of preventative mental health. Obviously, we're critical of that term in some ways, but I think the idea of like, how do we intervene earlier, or are there ways to help people before things become, insolubly difficult, right? And that's connected to the money in the sense that there's cost savings in that, right? So that's something worth considering. I think we've got time to drill down on one more thing before we maybe just post some alternatives and interesting thoughts to our listeners about, ways to approach the money that are a little bit different and maybe reconcile or address some of these challenges. But just in the side of greed, like, I feel like we can't end this episode without sort of pointing out and critiquing the idea that like the money changes what kind of therapy we provide, because our therapy industry is inundated with marketing. There's opportunities to make money as a therapist. And so, of course, there's people that are going to try to capitalize on that, and they're going to use all of the tricks, all the marketing and business tricks they can to maximize the amount of money that they can make in their field. And so that means that they, I think what I'm trying to say is it just influences the way that we practice therapy. It influences what kind of therapies we practice, the modalities that we get trained in. There are modalities that are sort of publicly recognized as popular and effective, and so there's incentive to get trained in those. And so it's like it's actually structured the whole landscape of the kind of services we provide, because we don't, most people, for instance, are going to be trained in CBT now because that's just something that in our zeitgeist is evidence-based, and there's been lots of marketing around that. And so it's sort of modeled and marketed as this effective thing. And so people know about it, they've heard of it, they want it, they're interested, CBT, EMDR, IFS, ACT, these are all popular. So but I think it's interesting to talk about that, because it's like, what would therapy be like if that wasn't at play, right? And what has that done to our space? How has it changed it, right? Is it a good thing that we're incentivized and encouraged to practice these things, or does it pose challenges? And I think it does.
I haven't thought about this as intensely. No, these are good. These are good questions. It's certainly, I would agree that, that pursuit of profit, right? And there's nothing wrong, as we've hopefully established. It's good to make an income, and making an income doing services that are providing, help to the world. I'd much rather do this than, selling credit cards that are keeping people in debt, or, something else, or like some speculation in thing, right? Where we're providing real value 100%. Here. But, unbridled, unregulated capitalism, like profit for profit sake, right? I need to please I just need to make more money. He who with the most toys dies. I need to pay off my stakeholders. They expect like continued growth. And if there's ever not continued growth, even if there was some really valuable reason, valuable service or initiative we were providing, there's one quarter we don't have, increased growth, like there you're fired out of your chair, Mr. CEO, right? Like, and more organizations can be running like this, right? There's in the States, we mentioned this in an earlier episode, Walmart has gotten into psychotherapy. But we can see maybe less brand name, examples of that even here in Canada, whether it's an individual or whether it's, a bigger corporate entity. But this piece around greed, absolutely, it influences. And I didn't think as much about maybe some of the potential, the treatments or the modalities. And I'd love to hear more about what you think about how greed influences that.
I'm thinking about historically, psychotherapy wasn't a particularly popular thing, but when it was offered, it was sort of just offered as what it was, right? When we think about the history of psychotherapy and its origins in psychoanalysis, psychoanalysis was what it was. It was a method, and there wasn't necessarily there was an interest in being expeditious. There's been interesting movements within the psychoanalytic community around speeding up the treatment, which is pretty cool, actually. But there was this idea of like, we can't really do this quickly. Like it's sort of the old trial, like you can't have things cheap, fast, and good. Like you get to pick two. And so if it's fast and good, it's not cheap. If it's cheap and fast, it's not good. Sure. And if it's good and cheap, it's not fast, right? And so I think there was and so I don't think that people necessarily griped about it, but over time and as different sort of factors have influenced the industry, I think there has been a greater interest in speeding things up. I think a big part of like, it would be really hard to make the argument that CBT and some of the other sort of third wave behavior therapies haven't been sort of purpose built for public health systems with the idea of cost management in mind, because it's something that makes their modalities more attractive and interesting. So, that's sort of there, right? Like it's a factor in the way that we think about therapy now. It's a factor in the way that our therapies are designed. We're always trying to think about how to do the best with the least amount of money and the least amount of time. And so if you want it cheap and fast, it's not going to be good. And I think that's what I'm saying, right? It's like, I wonder if there's been an erosion. Well, not even, okay, I don't even wonder. I'm just going to say it, that my hot take. I think there's been an erosion of quality because these factors that have influenced our therapy space have necessarily compromised on the kind of quality that we that we can provide in terms of support to our patients. We've talked a lot about, we did a whole episode on sort of the relational dimensions of psychotherapy. You know, Richard, you and I are both sort of exploring the psychoanalytic space. We talked about, you know, kind of person-centered therapy before and some of what it offers. Like, I think what's interesting about all of these therapies is they kind of structure a relational process, which you can't really market. Like, you can't make promises, you know, with these types of therapies. You can't say, like, you can't start with the outcome in mind, right? You don't really know where it's going to go. And that's sort of been the way that...
Yeah, what are you going to say? You have 50% better relationship?
Yeah.
Like, no.
And that's sort of been the way it's been with these. And it's not to say that there aren't efforts to better understand psychotherapy. And that's sort of what we're looking at in the great psychotherapy debate. And like, I'm all for the research that's being done and things like that. But I think we're talking about something that's difficult to quantify. It's difficult to sort of structure in a way where it can be universally deliverable and create reliable outcomes. There's an art to psychotherapy. And there's always going to be an art to psychotherapy.
Yes.
You know, and as a result of that, it eludes these efforts at standardization, manualization, and mechanization, right? But that's the direction that our therapy space is going in. And so I think if it's going to go in that direction, that's fine, but it's not going to be as good. It's not going to be as engaging. It's not going to be as effective in the way that's...
It's a problem.
in a way that's really meaningful to people. So, I mean... That's
the problem when you have that one-size-fits-all model.
That's right. But that's what the money does to us, is it encourages us to, like, you know, everyone's got that pressure to, like, you know, be able to put some certifications on their wall and say, I offer this, and this. And, you know, clients ask for it. They're like, hey, do you do EMDR? I hear EMDR is really good. I want to do this, right? So it's, that's the space that we live in. And I you know, it's not so simple, but I think we make it sound that simple. The money makes us make it that simple. We have to sort of brand ourselves.
Yeah.
And you know me, I sort of hate the idea that therapy has brands, you know, that you can be practicing Adidas therapy, but I'm more of a Nike. You're a Pepsi guy, but I'm a Coke. You know?
Please don't sue us, Adidas.
That's what and it's like we're all just wearing sweatpants, right? But no, it's, you know, somehow it's different.
And they're all made at the same factory. You find out.
So
that's a very good point.
Yeah. And like I said earlier, I practice the Gucci of psychotherapy. So
wow,
$2,000 an hour. But I you know.
But it's a very good point. About how cost constraints, what is available. It sometimes makes us jump to shortcuts, try to provide these universal fast fixes that are not, that sacrifice, you know, what might be best for a particular client. Because as you said, a big part of the art of psychotherapy, I believe, is matching the right treatment, the right frame, the right, you know, these ingredients, so to speak. Like, it's not like there's this exact formula, but I do think there's certainly principles or ingredients, maybe that's a better way of looking at it, that are important elements, right?
Of course,
to therapy. Yeah.
But I mean, like, you know, great example, you know, we went to this workshop and it's like, you can't market that. We can't turn around and go, oh yeah, you know, we offer this, you know, I mean, we're not analysts, but like, even just to say, you know, we engaged in an amazing, fascinating and in-depth discussion around the ethical principles of our care. But we can't turn around and market that. But if you go and you do a certification in CBT, you can turn around and say, oh yeah, I'm CBT certified. And so they're not equivalent, even though, you know, I feel like we got a really excellent, sort of learning experience in that workshop. I can't use that. And I think that's sort of interesting, right?
And there wasn't 200 people attending like there would be for an EMDR workshop or something.
I think what I'm trying to say is the value from that workshop was, I feel, immeasurably more than, you know, the skills workshops I've participated in the past around some of the behavior therapies. But, you know, it poses the problem of, like, if I want to go and, you know, be marketable to people, I'm sort of forced to consider those first and privilege those. So I think that's my hot take, Richard. That's all I want to say. Is just like,
I like your hot take.
You know, like, we have to think about the way the money has influenced us in the decisions that we make as therapists too, right?
And listeners should go back to that previous episode too, with the great psychotherapy debate and like the problem with clinical trials. Who was that? Jonathan
Shedler and Bruce Wampold. Yeah.
Because that comes down to a lot of it, right? Like, what is chosen in clinical trials is also largely an issue of money. Time and money.
Oh, well
right?
said.
So if we can have something that is manualized, that can be delivered in a shorter framework, we're paying those that participate in the trial less, the therapist less. So all of that is lower. And so grantors might be more likely to fit this, right? Or pick this.
Yeah.
Right? And it's going to go, and grants are a competitive process too. So it's going to go not towards who can provide maybe the best quality, but who can provide, this idea of I guess, just the good enough to achieve the objective. And certainly if it's lower cost and it's less time, then that looks the most attractive, even if it excludes a large amount of people.
I think within their debate, both of them acknowledge that money is at the heart of the problem of solving the great psychotherapy debate in some ways, that they both have the sense of, we could do the research that would really probably answer all the questions that we're trying to answer right now, but it would cost too much money to do it. So we sort of have to answer it with what we have, because we don't have enough money to answer it the way that we would like to, which is kind of a sad problem.
It's sad, This is where you get sometimes, especially if you're tenure track faculty or things like this, where you may have an ability to, and that's what I see, in academia, sometimes tenure track faculty that are, especially near the end of the career, they have, they've already achieved their grants, they've already shown value to the university, get their pension, all of it. And so there's some ability, and I see sometimes some really cool studies, right? And then they're a recognized name, and they are, trying to bring in new therapists and research assistants and stuff, that next generation of therapists, and to try to challenge some of these existing structures and existing studies that can be really, overly constrictive and extremely kind of profit driven, kind of as the overall goal. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, we've got a few minutes left, Richard, and so this is maybe where I want to bring in a fun segment for the end of the episode here. This is Glenn and Richard's solution-focused brief therapy segment, where we, for our listeners, will spend the next few minutes offering our solution-focused brief interventions on how to deal with the money. So what I mean by that is, this segment is about us offering, what we think are solutions, and we're going to do it in a brief fashion.
Love it.
Yeah. So I'll start. My first solution is know your worth. So for all the therapists out there, when it comes to this problem of the money, the problem of altruism and greed, one thing we've got to do is we do have to solve the problem of altruism. And so we do that by knowing our worth, right? I think, we've got to do a work around altruism, what drives altruism in us. And often it's a sense of worthlessness. Often we're altruistic as a defense against feeling worthless. We try to give in or create in others what we can't experience in ourselves. And so there's a lot to be worked through when it comes to dealing with altruism, but I think it can be encapsulated nicely in knowing our worth, trusting in our value, believing that we deserve, money and deserve enough when it comes to the work that we do, and asking for that from our employers, asking for that from ourselves, right? So that's my first point, solving the problem of the money. Richard, what do you got?
One that comes up to me is challenge the status quo, and with that kind of, if you're going to do that, don't get isolated. Have a community around you. It's pretty hard to challenge the status quo without a community around you. So we talked about collectives, co-ops, group action. Sometimes it's union action, being part of an association, formal and informal, and taking the initiative to, create these structures around us too, because there is a strength kind of in collective action to kind of challenge how things are done, maybe some predatory practices, and be able to offer something different to, with your colleagues, hopefully, that you like practicing with, and to clients, and to giving them some choice for some fair and high quality therapy. And I know we didn't have a chance to talk about it, but that could include even like really radical ideas, like thinking about barter counseling, these types of ideas as well.
I love it. Yeah. We'll maybe have to touch on that in another episode.
Alternative.
But like that's one way that we can retain our worth, but still create accessibility, right? Is to barter with clients as opposed to charging money, right? Clients can provide us things of value, and there's ways to safely and ethically do this.
Don't just do this like tomorrow without a framework.
No. But there's ways to safely and ethically negotiate with clients an alternative method they can pay. I always like my old supervisor, Linda. She used to work in remote communities in northern British Columbia. She talked about how some clients, she would provide them with therapy, and they'd come and they wouldn't pay her. But, in hunt and moose season, they'd come and they'd bring her half a moose, right? And this was, this fed her for like a while.
Oh, yeah.
And so it was like equivalent, right? And it was accepted that this is deemed okay, right? So That's a good example. Richard, can you mention something about collectives too? Because I do want to make sure our listeners are good on that. Like, I think you're right now in the midst of, I think, a really like a decent solution given the system we're in right now around the sort of problems of altruism and greed and how you handle the money. What's your collective all about?
So people can go to resolvetraumacollective.com. We also did a episode on Julia Smith, I believe, her fearless practice. So it is all about different private practitioners across Canada. Really simply, it's an idea of therapists coming in and basically sharing the costs of things. So you can do it in a lot of different ways, but the way that we do it is it's a membership model. So there is some people that still want to keep, for whatever reason, like split fee. And for right now, we do allow that. So we allow kind of that transition kind of grandparenting period. But the main idea is kind of this membership model where you're paying to cover some of the costs of like the supervision. So supervision with me, we have a group consultation, like a consultation group. And then because we are a collective or a group of therapists, we can negotiate lower prices at like business centers so that we get better rates and actually some better quality places. And they would much rather actually negotiate with us than a bunch of individual therapists on their own, because there's an accountability structure, because they know, they can always go after Richard if there's some issue, right? So there's that level of accountability. So we can also do things like pay for advertising. Like, so if I'm advertising, we're offering a group and I'm offering a group, then the other collective members are hopefully also going to advertise that group on their social media, etc., and vice versa. And we can get all the benefits of consulting with each other and marketing and sharing overhead costs. And we still like have our own, these are businesses, right? So you still need to be, register as a sole proprietor, or maybe you even have your own corporation or whatever. But it's this way of being able to share costs that allow some accountability and allow us to be able to do things that might normally be quite inaccessible to private practitioners, right? Like the cost of supervision can be a lot of money, these types of things, and allow us to kind of do this with a lot of diversity of different voices and a lot of diversity of different therapeutic modalities. We're gathered around like trauma-informed and attachment-based practices, but very diverse in terms of ethnicity and in terms of particular modalities. And that provides a great structure for getting better as a therapist, just improving in quality and accountability and we mentioned some ethical issues that can happen in isolation. This can reduce a lot of it, and a lot of research supports that these kind of communities of, really it is a community of practice structure, can help in all of these areas. So that's a very rough kind of general idea of what we're shooting towards, and we've already, I think, gone well on its way and have some members already that are in this membership structure, and they can leave or join whatever in a very flexible way, but there's also some level of accountability and commitment too. So yeah.
Oh, I love it, Richard. I think it's such a great way to reconcile, again, the sort of the greed and altruism. I think it's sort of like, it's a way of structuring a kind of group practice that has sort of the advantages of belonging to a community without the disadvantages and inequities of the sort of the fee split.
Yeah, or like an overly hierarchical command and control style. Yeah, exactly.
That's right.
Well, I'm glad you can see that. That's clear.
No, it leaves you all with a lot of autonomy and agency, but also you get to enjoy each other
we'll go for
and benefit
a
from each
beer
other,
and nachos every quarter and these types of things too, because it's important to actually have fun and keep accountable, not just for like good practice with clients, but our self-care and people that you actually want to talk with and share life with.
For sure. Yeah. All right. And then maybe the last brief solution focused point of the night, we'll just say, we've got to think about what is lost when the money isn't spent. So I mean that at both an individual level as therapists and at the public level as well. So when we're not spending money where we need to provide the services, then we can't reach the people that we need to. We end up with inequities and accessibility issues in our service. And when we think too much about the money as therapists, we can compromise the quality of our service. And so we've always got to think about what's lost when we don't spend the money. But I think that's it, Richard, for tonight. Okay. So thanks for hopping on, man. And always good to talk to you. Take care, okay?
Good talk to you too. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
We hope you enjoyed the podcast and are a little wiser for it.
Thanks for listening.